Hi, welcome to Rocky Mountain Views, and I'm your host, Martha Thompson. I do want to say something real quick before we begin. Today we're taping this on Saturday the 10th, and last night there was a tremendous amount of flooding in Manitou. There was one fatality. They still have a tremendous amount of cleanup to do. We'll be airing this episode tomorrow, so on the 11th is when you'll be watching this. If you are able-bodied and so inclined, they could really use some help in cleanup. I know we all love Manitou Springs and want to support them in any way that we can, so if you can't get out there with a shovel and help, please keep them in your heart and your prayers. It would be much appreciated. Thank you. Now today, our guest is someone that I have just fallen in head over heels respect for. He has taken an old elementary school, beautiful old building, the Ivywild Elementary School, and turned it into a thriving center for business, for the neighborhood, for our entire area. And it is an example of what can be done adjusting to the environment that it's placed in any place. So if you're watching this in Colorado or if you're watching this in Switzerland, this is something that you can use in your own backyard. So I'm happy today to welcome Jim Fennel, who is the brilliant mind behind the gentrification of Ivywild Elementary. Thank you for being here.
Thank you, Martha.
I guess I want to start with something that you and I discussed when we first met, when you spoke of how you became connected to and having a deeper sense, even a moral sense of responsibility about the environment. And you spoke about your dad. So let's talk about how you got so smart.
Oh, well, thanks. You know, the idea behind Ivywild really is multifaceted, and so one of the components is the environmental piece. And growing up, my dad had a great connection to his property. He really understood how the natural systems worked, and he managed the trees, the forest, and the erosion control measures, and just things like that. He just had a great sense of what needed to be done to sort of sustain the land and the water, and to keep things healthy and pure.
And you've incorporated all of that in Ivywild. And let's talk about, in your book, which I also learned so much about, there are things that caught me up short and I need to work on, but I also found a lot of things we're doing right, which made me really happy. But symbiosis is a big part of what you do. Can you explain how you relate to that word and how it relates to Ivywild?
Oh, absolutely. You know, if you were to explore the definition of symbiosis, and you see that it really relates specifically to biology. You know, it talks about mutually beneficial relationships between organisms. Well, we just wanted to apply that same thinking in our built environment, because if we can create these beneficial relationships on an environmental level and in a functional or economic level, and then again at a cultural level, it really does create longer-term sustainability.
And there are 3 levels of symbiosis that you speak of in your book, and that is evident if you spend time there. And I've been there 3 times this past week because it's fun and it's a great place to be, to have coffee, to have meetings, or to just hang out and have some of the most delicious food ever. So, or if you want to stop by and have a beer, you could do that too. But I'd like to go over the 3 levels and how they relate to Ivywild, but also how they could apply to any other Ivywild in another area.
Sure. Well, we have a rendering that you've seen, and it shows the old school, and at one end it shows one of the anchor tenants, the brewery. This is Bristol Brewing Company. And the idea was to align businesses for the purpose of exchanging the byproducts of their activities and operations, so that ideally we could minimize waste and ultimately eliminate waste by repurposing everything, by making the byproducts useful for someone else. So the businesses, or this is the functional symbiosis piece, so there's the environmental and the functional and the cultural. So the functional piece is the alignment of the businesses. So that's what you see kind of in the rendering, is that there's a brewery on one end and then a greenhouse on the other. And so if you look at the byproducts of the brewing operation, you have water and spent grain and heat. Well, we can use the gray water or the rinse water as irrigation for the plants in the greenhouse and on the surface gardens. And then we can use the spent grains for compost and fertilizer for the plants in the greenhouse and on the surface gardens. And the heat recovery is very, most all of us are familiar with that because there are ways to move heat around within facilities to capture that resource.
Okay, now Bristol is one of the three main businesses that are there. What are the other two, and what do they bring to this relationship?
Well, there are three partners in the development. Bristol Brewing Company is one, or Mike Bristol. And then Joe Coleman is the owner of the Blue Star. That's a popular restaurant in Colorado Springs. And Joe is responsible for all of the food service operations in the facility. And then Fennel Group is the third partner. So I'm operating the design, the architectural and planning office out of the school.
Okay. So you've talked about what Bristol Brewery brings to the functionality.
Mm-hmm.
What do the other two? How do they all help each other? What is that continuous loop? How is that created?
The thing that really makes a development like this work is to try to create that structure, that loop structure that starts to create greater self-reliance and greater sustainability. And so by taking the byproducts of the brewery and kind of jump-starting this agricultural piece, then we immediately have a resource that can be used in the restaurant, because the idea is to take the food that's grown on site, to repurpose that and actually serve it. So it's almost full circle there. And in terms of the design practice and the presence of having the architect and planner and everyone who's involved in that aspect really contributes more to the cultural piece that we can talk about a little bit later.
Well, let's talk about that, because there's a lot more going on at Ivywild that I've discovered than having great baked goods or having a great meal or stopping for a beer. There's a whole lot more going on there, and I definitely want to talk about that. And while some things are specific to Colorado Springs, how they could be adapted to other environments, to other places on the planet.
Sure.
Because we have people who watch us all over the world. So how could they capture this model, and where can they get your book too? Because it is pretty well laid out in why you do what you do and how you do it. So,
well, one of the, probably in our opinion at least, the most critical decisions is to do what you just said, to recognize exactly where we are on planet Earth. I mean, every single climate, every single microclimate is unique. And so the first thing that we wanted to do at Ivywild was to have a very good understanding of the locale. And there's, this has to do with the environmental piece, but you'll see that it's kind of all wrapped together. So again, if we were to look at the rendering, and it shows kind of this relationship between the additions on either end of the building, there were very conscious decisions about where things were located and how they were oriented to respond specifically to the climate. This was a building that was built in 1916, and it had two additions, one in 1951 and then another in 1953. And anyone who knows about those kinds of eras of construction would know that they're very inefficient today, because they're mostly reinforced masonry construction. There's no insulation in the walls. And we had a real challenge in terms of how we were going to make this building efficient. So the environmental piece began to come into play, because we made decisions about where to locate the fermentation addition for the brewery, for example, and we chose to put that on the north side of the building. We had this two-story uninsulated masonry wall that was very inefficient. We put a use there that produced its own heat, basically, and then we surrounded that with a thermal envelope to make it highly efficient. And then on the south side, we did just the opposite. We put a greenhouse there, so we could create literally a greenhouse effect. In the wintertime, any excess heat could be captured and repurposed elsewhere in the building. So there were some environmental decisions that went along with the placement of the different uses. And then in terms of the way the building exterior skin was modified, we proposed shading devices on the east and west sides, and those are being developed right now. So just simple things like blocking the sun before it comes into the building, so that we don't have to use electricity to pump the heat back out of the building. We just prevent it in the first place.
And you're not using air conditioning because it's not necessary, because you've been proactive.
That's right. And in our climate, that works very well. Obviously, in places like the southeastern part of the United States, or in other places where you do have higher humidity levels, there are other systems that can be used, and combined with more passive systems so that you don't have the ongoing energy requirements to run those systems.
It makes sense. I don't know. I think a lot of this you think is common knowledge. I don't know that it's common knowledge, because if it were, this would be being done, more around the country, at least in the U.S. Actually, I think probably the Europeans are way ahead of us on many levels in this. I think that one of the things that comes up is that anyone who is a developer is going to want to maximize profit. I've not seen, I shouldn't say they just don't, I've not seen very much thought go into the environment, the culture, and I think that it's probably because there's so much thought about, okay, we've got to maximize profit here. Have you found that that it's cost you to be socially conscious and environmentally conscious? There's actually a chapter. I know you've read the book, and thank you for that. There's a chapter on land development, and we feel that really one of the things that makes the model work is that it takes outside speculation away from the formula, and it puts that back into the hands of the neighborhood, for people who are vested in their neighborhoods. So when you have civic and community-minded entrepreneurs leading the charge for these things, then suddenly the profit that may have gone elsewhere stays in the job. It stays on site, it stays in the neighborhood. And so you have more control over what you can do by creating these opportunities to build the local culture. I get it. I like it. Now, talking about the neighborhood, one of the things that you really take into account is accessibility. How long does it take to get there? And there are some real benefits to that. So let's talk about some of those that you think of when you're putting something together, Jim.
Okay. Well, when we mentioned the rendering already a couple of times, and there's also a sketch of the streetscape that shows the connection from Tejon Street, which is really the main street in Colorado Springs, that stretches back up to the school. And we wanted to reinforce that connection between Tejon Street, one of our main streets, and the main entrance, and to create this pedestrian environment, one that's oriented more toward the pedestrian, less toward the automobile. Now, obviously, getting people to the site is very important, and a lot of people drive. I mean, driving is a big part of our culture, and yet, there is, as you know, we're trying to do better. We're trying to create developments that promote walkability and that promote better connections between facilities like this and the surrounding neighborhoods. So we just wanted to do that very thing. We wanted to encourage people to ride their bikes and to walk and to drive less, if that's possible. So when you see the development, it's modeled after some of the early American small towns that you might imagine, where you have a smaller streetscape, and you have parallel parking, and you have street trees, and all of the things that you would associate with a typical small street, and yet it has a very pedestrian feel to it. And so that's what we're trying to accomplish.
And walkability what is your general distance for that? When you're thinking, okay, we're going to put this together, we want to make this accessible by foot. What's your space that you allow for that? Is it half mile? Is it 1 mile? What do you think of when you're drawing that up?
Basically a quarter of a mile radius. If many of the planning texts that are out there say that a 1,200 foot radius is about right for walkability. That if you start to get a little bit beyond that people would rather drive or ride their bikes. I'm not sure what the radius is for bike riding.
I would think a half mile would be cake even
you would
for
think.
me. Okay. All right. So those are the nuts and bolts of Ivywild and what you've put together. And as I told you when you came in here today, I have such respect for what you do. I've never used notes for any interview, but you've got so much here that I really don't want to miss anything. When you talk about the effects of gentrification and reinvesting in the neighborhood, how is that different from someone who decided to come in and bulldoze that school? What are the benefits? What are the downsides of what you did? Is there more of a struggle in what you did? Let's talk about some of that, because I think that's a big concern for people too. We love our old buildings, but is it going to serve us? How do you figure that out?
Well, that's a great subject to discuss, and obviously every context would be different. We were blessed because we had a neighborhood that was absolutely in love with the school and wanted to preserve it. You know, we also had businesses that were very well established in the area already, and you know, people had that familiarity and connection to the businesses. And so as soon as the neighborhood learned that the school was being closed, they were very upset. The last thing they wanted was a boarded up school, or worse, a bulldozed school in their neighborhood.
That was the scary part, because it is just a stunning building.
It's beautiful.
Yeah.
And so, you know, it's very easy to get support for preservation of the school. The more difficult sell was the repurposing of the school. What will it be used for? How will it affect the surrounding neighbors?
Right.
And because they had familiarity with the businesses, you know, and they were local businesses, and again, these weren't outside speculators coming in, these were folks that were established in the neighborhood. By having that formula in place, it made it much easier to get the neighborhood behind the project, and actually we couldn't have done it without them. We're very, very pleased to have their support.
I agree completely, and that makes sense. Again, everything you do, you know, it makes perfect sense. I just don't know why it's taken us so long to get to this. Maybe someday you can explain that to me. We also talked about having different paths to invite people. So is that part of the transportation and getting there, or are you referring to the culture itself?
We probably should spend a little more time talking about the cultural piece.
Okay.
And I know we had discussed this earlier, but
Yes.
the idea is that, you know, it kind of it's a circular structure, right? But it begins and ends with the cultural piece. Because to start a project like this, everyone involved has to sign this sort of informal cultural agreement. They have to say, this is what we want to do, we're all on board with this, and we're committed to it. And so it's a journey. We're going to take as many loops as it takes to get around and get this and make it happen.
Right.
And maybe when we open our doors, we're through with phase 1, but we know that phases 2 and 3 are out there and they're coming. So it starts with this idea of signing that informal agreement. But then as it grows, it spreads kind of to the surrounding neighborhood and community. And I know you've been to the site and you've seen this. You know, the neighbors have a skip in their step now. You know, their sense of pride in their neighborhood has been elevated, and they're very excited about that. We're excited about it too. And so that contributes directly to a gentrification of the neighborhood, because there have already been some sales of properties and people investing more in their properties to try to improve the appearance, the curb appeal, and so forth. And people are just taking a greater sense of pride in their neighborhood now.
I have noticed that. I have seen that in neighbors, and I'm seeing just some subtle changes taking place in people's yards as I drive by. There is some real pride, and you feel connected, rooted,
Right. Yes.
and a part of. And I think it has a lot to do with how open it is and welcoming. It's a very welcoming place. The next thing that you talked about when we met, that I was completely unaware of, are the educational opportunities that can be had with the different businesses, with the different opportunities provided by this type of structure. So I know we can talk about Pikes Peak Community College, we can talk about the different types of education, and yeah, let's just start going through that, because there's
Sure.
so much there, Jim.
Okay. The idea, one of the line items on the cultural agreement, is that everyone has some aspect of education involved in what they're doing.
Okay.
So from the brewery standpoint, for example, they provide tours and offer detailed explanations of their process and how that works. And if there's a home brewer, for example, or somebody who's just generally interested in the technology, it's very interesting. It's, you know, I get excited about this because I used to make beer myself.
Oh, did you?
Yeah.
I've only made root beer, and I think we almost blew up the roof because the cork started to come out and pop up.
Yeah.
A little too much yeast, I
So,
think.
yeah. So, you know, people come in, they see the process firsthand, they see all the equipment, and they say, you know, I could do this. So they can take that back with them. The same thing can be said for any of the other entities on the project. You know, the idea is that the baker, Alicia, is very excited. I know my daughter has been down there and she's watched Alicia, And there are programs planned to get kids from the neighborhood or from elsewhere in the community to come in and learn how to bake cakes or make chocolate or do icing.
Really?
Or to bake breads. Some of the things that have been maybe forgotten in our culture about canning, how to deal with making things last a little bit longer, taking things from the garden, preparing those, using those. The long-term goal is to create a way to get people more interested in all those aspects of sustainability, whether it's gardening, baking, sautéing vegetables, whatever that is, even canning, things like that. From our standpoint, it could be applicable to renewable energy systems, for example. I know that one of our consultants is a pioneer, by the way, in solar technologies. He used to work for a company in Michigan who pioneered thin film technology for solar panels.
Okay.
And so he's very interested in leading a class on Saturday mornings, maybe while watching a football game out of the corner of their eye. Guys from the neighborhood or the community can come in and make solar panels. Yes, that's it. So that would be great. I mean, the whole place could smell like solder for a couple of hours. But but the point is, there are so many aspects of this district-based infrastructure that can be applied to a unit-based or a home setting or an office building or any building, any aspect of the built environment can start to use this concept, this structure.
Wow. So if somebody wants to arrange for their classroom or their child's classroom to go through, how do they do that with Ivywild?
Well, there's an events coordinator.
Okay.
And she basically organizes all of the activities. And we have this half-court gymnasium, which is very cool. I know you've seen that. And it's nice because everything is scaled for elementary school kids.
It is.
And so there's a small stage, but it's very nice. And we have the spaces available to hold events like that, whether it's more of a classroom setting or even if it's a performance of some type.
Okay. So we'll make sure that we put up all of that information up on the screen so you know how to contact the events coordinator if you happen to be in Southern Colorado, in case you want to learn how to can. You want to make, I've got to tell you, Alicia's baking is something that if you start, you're not going to be able to stop. I have chocolate brownies, 2 left at home right now, and I know how many are there. And the most amazing breads, and just everything there is fantastic. So we'll have courses that we can go to. You have something very unique and interesting at Ivywild, and you plug your car into it. Let's talk about that. I love this.
Well, we had a tour just this week. The Historical Preservation Alliance wanted to walk through the building, and everybody kept asking me, well, do you have your own parking space? And I said, well, no, not really. But actually, I'm the only guy who drives an electric car right now, and we do have an electric vehicle charging station. So technically, it's not my own personal parking space, but I can use it for now.
Since you're the only one that uses it. But I think that's so fantastic. And where does that power come from? How is that powered up?
Well, about 2 years ago, there was a great incentive program out there to buy and install solar panels. So we took advantage of that, and we built a freestanding, self-contained parking canopy that has 20 solar panels, or 12 solar panels. It produces just enough power to charge the vehicle. So I have a Nissan Leaf, and it can plug in there, and it's actually powered by the sun.
It's so cool looking too. I mean, it looks great. You also have quite a bit of power in that car. That's unique too.
It is.
You were telling me about that. You don't have to go 30 miles an hour, people. Talk about your car.
Well,
I love this.
Well, thanks. Anybody that is familiar with electric vehicles or electric motors in general knows this. They have full torque at 0. So as soon as you apply the pedal, because there's no gas, there's no engine, no transmission, no radiator, no fluids, none of that sort of thing. Strictly an electric motor. But whenever you hit the pedal, it's full torque and it's gone. You can feel it really almost trying to get away from you.
Any tickets?
No, thank goodness.
Did it take time to learn how to do that?
Oh, absolutely.
Because I would think you need to learn.
Yeah, very different.
Okay. Now you have a grand opening coming up on the afternoon of the 16th.
Yes.
And the address of Ivywild Elementary is?
It's 1604 South Cascade Avenue.
All right, 1604 South Cascade Avenue in Colorado Springs. Let's talk about some of the things that are going to be happening at the open house. I'm unaware of any events or exactly how that's going to be conducted, so I just know I'm going to be there.
Great.
So let's talk about that.
Okay, well, you know, things get kicked off in the afternoon,
Okay.
and I know that there's a full schedule posted on the Facebook page for the Ivywild School,
Okay,
and
great.
that's very easy to find. And I know that Mayor Bach will be there making some opening remarks, and obviously we want to thank everyone because we have a long list of people who helped make this possible, and you know, we're certainly grateful to all those folks. And then I think after that there'll be a few events. I know there's a marching band that kind of kicks things off, and then we'll just do a general walkthrough of the facility, and there'll be events going on through the evening, and then all the next day, Saturday.
Oh, all day Saturday as
Yes,
well.
mhm.
Outstanding.
Kind
So
of
the
ending with a big
16th
band and party in the evening.
All right, 16th and 17th at Ivywild School, so mid-afternoon on Friday the 16th and all day on Saturday. We're going to put up at the very last of this, we're going to have just a couple of very short clips of the businesses inside Ivywild. So I'm going to break for here. I could talk to you all day. I am thrilled that Ivywild is within range of where I live, because it's a wonderful addition, not just to that neighborhood, but to Colorado Springs and Colorado, and you've done all of us an incredible service. I cannot thank you enough.
Well, thank you, Martha. Look forward to seeing you down there.
You will. All right, folks, so we'll finish out with a couple of video vignettes, but we'll have full-length video of the individual businesses. You'll be able to catch those. We'll be posting those as soon as we can. Thanks for joining us today. Be safe. Well, hi, here we are at the Old School Bakery, and I'm here with the owner.
Alicia Prescott.
Alicia.
Yeah, I'm so.
Okay, well, now we're actually in the principal's office, which is a terrific bar, place for coffees, and I'm speaking to the bar manager, and you are?
Eric Harry.
Nice to meet you.
Nice to meet you too.
Thanks for stopping in the middle of the day.
Sure.
Okay, well, now we're over at the Meat Locker, and I'm talking to the chef and general manager, Mark Henry. Mark, thanks for taking a minute.
No problem.
I'm stopping everyone in the middle of their business day, making it crazy today.
Kind of
but
happens here in the open air environment that we've got going.
All right, so we're here where the real fun begins. This is where you find the beer. Why don't you introduce yourself and tell us about your wonderful facility here?
Well, I am Tom Zarenko. I'm the general manager here at Bristol Brewing Company. And welcome to our new home at the Ivywild Elementary School.
Which is so cool.
Yeah, we moved